Today on our exciting agenda, so let's get straight to it, and let me introduce TRT World's own Ömer Kablan with his one-on-one talk entitled How Algorithms Shape Human Life.
Thank you, Andrea. Now, welcome once more to the International Strategic Communications Summit. Our discussion on this Sunday morning is entitled How Algorithms Change Human Life. It's a very important topic for all of us because algorithms are everywhere. They're always at work. And you may not be aware of this, but they're shaping the world we live in, and even our decisions. To talk more about how these invisible pieces of code influence us, we have a great guest, David Carroll, who's an associate professor of media design at Parsons School of Design at the New School. He starred in The Great Hack on Netflix and is known for legally challenging Cambridge Analytica. So thanks for joining us, David. So to kick it off, let's just start with what are algorithms?
Sure. Great to be here. Glad to be here remotely and to talk about this very important topic, algorithms. What are they? In the simplest way to describe them, they are the sub-computer programs that are turning data into functionality. And the way that they work is they make decisions based on inputs and produce outputs, and they can be simple or incredibly complex. And they are increasingly driven by data models, so are trained with machine learning so that these algorithms are increasingly automated and are making decisions in ways that we increasingly do not understand.
Now, David, I recently read a survey that they asked 100 people what they think about algorithms, and about a quarter of them said they think algorithms are evil. What do you have to say about this?
Well, maybe people are understanding the effects of these machines on societies and the civic order, so they are attributing some downstream effects to them. But because they're not well understood, it's easy to misplace some of these sentiments. They are programs written by people and are driven by human decisions. So while they are not intended to express a morality or an ethics, they do because of the fact that humans make them.
So do you think there's a way for us to reassure ourselves that algorithms won't abuse us?
There's no assurance that that's the case unless we develop a mechanism to assure a concept that we could call algorithmic justice or algorithmic accountability. If these machines are increasingly going to determine the civic order, then what is the regime that holds algorithms accountable? When an algorithm is responsible for violence or destruction, who is responsible? Is the company that owns the algorithm? Is the engineer who wrote the algorithm? These are important questions because algorithms cannot be an exit from governance, but they will be if we do nothing.
So that's a good point you raise. Who is responsible if things do turn sour? Can anyone actually be held accountable?
We need to figure this out. We need to figure out, can we as humans understand algorithms as they increasingly take on the attributes of the sort of alien brain of machine learning and artificial intelligences? Do they have to be made, more regulatable? That is, they have to explain their own decisions. They have to be more transparent. They have to abide by disclosure regulations. Ultimately, my Cambridge Analytica data quest was about disclosure and was about testing the data protection regulatory regime. Can it do what it says it can do and answer to human rights? And unfortunately, I don't feel that it succeeded. And so we do not yet have a mechanism of just simple transparency, simple disclosure, simple explanation that is the first building block toward algorithmic accountability. If we can't recover our data, then we certainly can't recover how algorithms are interfering with our expression of free will.
Do you think the future is bleak then when you talk about how this is violating our human rights?
I went into the Cambridge Analytica fiasco with optimism that it would be a chance for the basis that undergirds the notion of human rights as expressed through international governance, and it would be a place to find resolution and answers and truth. But unfortunately, the investigation was stymied and obstructed and never resulted in a conclusion, and the regulators never really succeeded at delivering a satisfactory result. And so it leaves me personally feeling disappointed. Ultimately, it took journalists, whistleblowers, leakers, the free press to hold accountable those who are supposed to hold accountable. So we're still relying on the sort of last resort of free press and whistleblowing. And I feel like that's the sign of a broken system.
Now, David, everyone in this room, myself, you, we all use social media applications like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and we don't pay for these applications. And over the last few years, there's this idea that if you're not paying for those products, you are the product. What do you have to say about this?
Well, this is the business model that was developed almost 20 years ago, the advent of Silicon Valley, and at the same time that the concept of the internet was developed, and it took a long time to develop a business model around it. But ultimately, our data is collected, monetized, and harvested to better allocate attention. And so really it is an attention economy, or at least tries to be. And that is the relationship between our personal data and the information that then we consume. And so there's a direct link between those two elements now. But indeed, the real customers to the platforms are not us. It is the legions of advertisers that increasingly rely on these platforms to acquire and maintain relationships with their customers. And so we've seen attempts by advertisers to potentially boycott these platforms for malfeasance, but these boycotts don't work because there aren't really other alternatives in the market to reach customers. So we could say we are the product, but we could also say that the real customers don't have much choice either.
And do you think we're becoming more and more heavily reliant on these algorithms?
Absolutely. There are so many market incentives to deploy them for efficiencies, cost savings, labor reduction, automation, or as we said before, shifting liabilities to entities and actors that will ultimately escape and exit from liability. So a list too long to account for as the incentives and motivations to deploy algorithms in various ways.
And do you think such proliferation of algorithms eroding our creativity, the idea that we can think for ourselves?
Certainly, I worry about curiosity in particular, that we have surrendered to algorithms the recommendations for what to look at next. And we have or potentially the ability, the atrophy, there's an atrophy of our ability to continue to seek answers when they are constantly delivered to us with increasing ease. So in terms of curiosity, I worry about that. And then what's interesting is more recently, machine learning is starting to create works, texts, images, and other things that we would normally think contain in the domain of aesthetics. And so we are entering a new phase of the relationship between creativity and human augmentation. And there will be effects. Some will be positive, some will be negative. It's unclear. We're at the early days of automated creativity.
And just to follow up on that, of course, right now, there's also talk of an artificial intelligence arms race between superpowers. So how does that fit into the power of algorithms?
Certainly it relates to the overarching question of authoritarianism or human rights, that if a political regime is governed with effective human rights as expressed through data rights and digital protections, then you could see individual liberty and human rights and democracy thriving as an antidote to a system that would not provision for that, because the algorithms become an engine of social control as opposed to social freedoms. To express that more differently, the filmmakers of The Great Hack made 2 films recently, and the first film was The Square, the story about the Egyptian revolution, and expressing a feeling that social media would topple regimes and spread democracy. And then their follow-up film, The Great Hack, was reconsidering that.
And David, of course, we hear this term often, fake news. We hear it on the news itself. We hear politicians using this. We hear people using it in day-to-day conversation as well. It's become quite widespread. Do you think the dissemination of fake news is happened due to the way algorithms have been abused?
I do believe that the emergence of what we understand fake news to be, and it is defined differently by who you talk to, but algorithms and the incentives that they perpetuate certainly contribute this. That is, the ability to custom micro-target content to people that only small segments of the population see, and to target those based on a response feedback loop, to be able to tailor messages to people that prove their receptivity to them, but also the sort of financial incentives that you produce content that the algorithm optimizes for. And so false information and information that agitates our emotions performs better to our stimulus. And so the algorithm rewards it through attention, but most importantly, money. And so there are tremendous business models in producing basically information pollution at the minimum. That it is the most profitable way to make money on the internet is to produce toxic garbage. And so there are plenty of actors who are sort of non-political, but have been able to exploit the system because it is extremely lucrative to produce junk news on the internet. And companies like Facebook and Google allow the monetization and targeting at scale. In fact, some of the Facebook papers that were released by Frances Haugen show internal employees describing how the best way to use Facebook is to create a content click farm and be a troll. And Facebook algorithms advantage troll farms, and they know this internally.
One thing, personally speaking, is that, and I think we all kind of feel this, but to bring this back to layman's terms, for example, sometimes on Twitter or on my Instagram, I get an ad about something I've been thinking about. Maybe it's a holiday ad. If I'm thinking about buying a new table for my house, I get a table ad popping up there, and it kind of spooks me out a little bit, because I don't remember searching for, I feel like it's reading my thoughts sometimes, and it kind of follows me around from social media application to social media application. Should those types of things scare us?
Sure. This is wonderful. This is a part of the opening scene to The Great Hack, so thanks for the reference. The most wonderful, strange, bizarre conspiracy theory, to me, is the conspiracy theory that people think their microphone is listening to their conversations to target them for ads. But of course, that's not happening, and there's no need for that, because the industry has collected enough data about us and is constantly doing so that it is able to target us for ads, and it seems like it is reading our mind, but it's just the targeting being effective. It's just the mass amounts of data being recombined, reattached to our identity, used in effective targeting schemes. But most importantly, it's showing us what the affinity engine is working. That is, there are other people who are like us, who are thinking like us, and who exhibit the same patterns as us. And we don't like to admit that there are people just like us. We like to think that we're totally unique individuals and no one else could have our ideas. But when you're a consumer, you're just a segmentation. And unfortunately, lots of consumers behave exactly the same way, and it's easy to predict our behaviors.
David, can you briefly explain, you took Cambridge Analytica to court. What type of institution are they, and what were you asking for?
Well, they're technically a defunct institution now that was able to use insolvency law in the UK and bankruptcy law in the United States to essentially evade absolute accountability, because the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK had jurisdiction over the company, being a UK entity that collected data and processed it in the United Kingdom in connection with the presidential election of 2016. And so in so doing, it became a jurisdiction in the UK. So the data profiles of US voters was investigated by the UK authorities in the most significant digital forensics investigation by a data protection regulator in history. And they did determine that the company SCL Group, which was an outgrowth of the UK defense industry that later got into political campaigning and was intentionally trying to modify information operations techniques and strategies for commercial and political activities. And in so doing, they violated UK Data Protection Act by unlawfully creating political profiles of Americans without their knowledge or consent. But because they went out of business, there was nothing that could be done. It could not be prosecuted in any meaningful way. And then furthermore, the ICO was not able to cooperate with US authorities, namely the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the Federal Election Commission that we know of. And they were not able to share anything they discovered on the servers seized under a criminal warrant. And so those investigations were inconclusive. They were not able to come to a conclusion as to the matter of Cambridge Analytica. They simply did not have cooperation from witnesses or the UK government.
Okay. Speaking of Google and Facebook once more, do you think when the tech engineers over there are creating these algorithms, these patterns, are they aware exactly of the ramifications? Do they know exactly how those algorithms are going to react? Is it something precise?
No, many designers of algorithms do not understand exactly how they work, cannot explain the outputs. What's kind of interesting is to think about that computers, the human brain can think in 3 dimensions, maybe 4, but no more than 4. Computers can think in any number of dimensions required to solve a problem or to come up with a prediction or a model. And so it sort of defies our human ability to comprehend. And yet they can arrive at outputs that seem to make sense to us. They can draw pictures that we can recognize. They can make human faces that seem like they're real. But they have arrived at these outputs in a manner that our brain cannot comprehend. And so we need mechanisms and tools to translate it for our feeble brains, basically. And so this is an important part of transparency that we have a lot of work to do on.
In my circle, and then the generation after me, people everywhere, you go on the street, when you go to a touristic location, when you go to a restaurant, we're all taking photos of our food, of monuments, of ourselves, selfies. We're exposing ourselves to the world. We're leaving a digital footprint voluntarily. We want to be seen. In the future, do you think there'll be a lashback of this? Do you think it'll hit back at us?
Well, I think the key thing that I learned is to appreciate the fundamental difference between the approach of the European Union and the United States as to this question. The European Union believes fundamentally that this information still belongs to us, even though it's out there, and that we still maintain rights to it. And if it's attached to our identity, it is an expression of our dignity, and so therefore we must exert control over it. Whereas in the United States, it's a different philosophy, and it's almost like once you leave your home, all bets are off. It's finders, keepers, losers, weepers. Once you put your data out there, you lose control of it. And I think that the European Union has a much more enlightened vision for this that's much more compatible with the 21st century and beyond. And the United States philosophy of it is actually completely outdated and dangerously so, and is slowly being updated. We see a couple of states in the US passing laws that's starting to move in the other direction, namely California and Virginia, but maybe others. So this is the main difference, and the European model, I think, would allow a more responsible way to share, to put information out there, knowing that we still maintain rights to it, even as it circulates, and we can exert those rights as necessary, and there are regimes that allow us to do so and support us in so. And so that's the balance between individual rights, liberty, and dignity, and the machine, and the government, and the corporation.
And David, can you just explain what big data is and its relationship with algorithms?
Big data are the data sets that algorithms use to create their models. So to use the Cambridge Analytica story as a basis, the data sets included the voter registrations of every US voter, the data broker offerings that are available on the commercial market from political and commercial data brokers that's attached to the voter profile. And in their case, they also collected Facebook accounts of a subset of those, created a model, and then applied that to everyone else. And then that model allowed a prediction to be created of every US voter. And so every US voter had a sort of a dossier connected to them, and that did include a personality profile of every single voter that was created from the model. So the data set is the big data. It trains the model to make predictions, and then the model outputs predictions with various levels of confidence associated to each prediction. And the quality of the confidence is based on the quality of the data and the quality of the algorithm. And indeed, we should even have disclosure of those confidence values. That would be one of the things that I fought for under the law, and the law said I was entitled to. They just couldn't actually get it disclosed.
David, so something I'm also curious about, again, something personal, just trying to keep it more relatable to all of us, perhaps even if we're not interested so much in technology. For example, when I go to the supermarket or when I go to buy a pair of jeans, we're faced with the paradox of choice. There's so many options. Maybe there's 15 pairs of jeans, 15 styles. I go to the supermarket, there's 10 types of soup, 10 types of pasta, and we're kind of confused. And we eventually choose one. And do you think that choice I'm making is kind of my reaction to everything I've been exposed to, including algorithms?
Certainly, consumer choices are one of the primary behaviors that the entire system is trying to influence. And it's not necessarily a rational choice either that we make. And we set up these loyalties based on many irrational qualities. And then, of course, many times in the store, we're choosing amongst brands that are owned by all one company. So the choice is an illusion from many different levels, actually.
Now, this is a strategic communication summit, David. So when we talk about communication strategies, how do algorithms play a role? How important are they?
Well, algorithms are being used in many different sectors for many different purposes, and are open source and off the shelf, and anyone can use them, and will increasingly be just a screwdriver or a hammer, just a basic tool that is available and usable and a general purpose and also specializable. But the thing about algorithms is then they create behavioral incentives. And people are not necessarily conscious of the incentives that algorithms impose upon us. And anyone who has used social media with any degree of self-consciousness can feel the emotional effects of the algorithms on you. If you've ever had a tweet go viral, it bombards you with stimulus that can become addictive. And many people, I do believe, become sort of addicted to the feelings that the algorithms is imposing on them. And then their behavior, consciously and subconsciously, adjusts to achieve the desired goals that the algorithm is optimizing for. And so there's a reason when you go on YouTube and all of the YouTube thumbnail frames all look the same. They're all being optimized for the YouTube algorithm, and people are imitating each other, realizing that that's how you play the algorithm. So when the creator economy starts to really examine itself, it's increasingly working for the algorithm. And we're hearing stories of young creators experiencing burnout because they can't keep up with the demands of the machine. The machine is putting unrealistic expectations on people, and it's a completely computerized labor market. So it's survival of the fittest to the extreme.
David, I have one last question for you, but before I get to that, I just want to look at the audience. If there's any questions in the audience for David, I can take it. We have one over here.
Ask your question.
Hello, Mr. David. I wonder your thoughts on algorithmic literacy. Thank you.
The question is algorithmic literacy, if I understood that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think the first step towards literacy is transparency. So, simple, the height of access. Can you request your data and then it is delivered to you in a satisfactory manner? Is the results of the outputs, have they been explained adequately and as legally mandated? Probably not. Can that be challenged and then an adequate answer delivered? If we get to that point, then we could get to algorithmic literacy. We would have the tools to create such a thing. But I don't know if we have even the tools to create algorithmic literacy if we cannot get our data and get the explanations as to the algorithmic processing associated to it. We have that, then maybe we can start to develop algorithmic literacy.
If we don't have any other questions from the audience, I'll ask my final question, David. David, so just to concluding remarks now, at the end of the day, when we talk about algorithms, do you think they solve more problems for us than the problems they create?
Algorithms are necessary to the advancement of digital technology. The amount of data produced is so vast that there's just an absolute need to create mechanisms to sift, organize, and sort through it. So algorithms are necessary. They just need to be developed with human rights and the civic order in mind.
David Carroll, thank you very much for joining me at this discussion. And we can conclude it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.